Okay. Can you hear me well if I speak like this? Okay. So, first of all, really thank you very much, Sofia, Tatiana, and the Observatory of the Far Right for organizing the conference and for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's also my first time in Lisbon, so it's been a pleasure to come to Lisbon for this, on this occasion. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I will, I think you probably can understand my English. I'm Italian, so I speak with a heavy Italian accent, so I think it's probably going to be easier. So I'm going really to say some of the main arguments that are laid out in this book that was published now almost 5 years ago in English, and it's been translated in Spanish, so I thought I would just show you that it's also available in other languages in case some of you might not read English. It's also available in Spanish, and the next slide, and also in Italian and in French. Obviously, I'm very happy that there has been interest in this book, but at the same time, it is also a matter of concern, because clearly some of the things, or many of the things that I speak about in this book, are already widespread in these countries, Italy, France, which are countries on which my book has focused, but are becoming more widespread even in other countries. So to the excitement and, if you want, joy about the work being translated, there is also some sorrow that this is becoming a reality, increasingly widespread reality, also in other contexts. But I wanted to first tell you a little bit what prompted me to write this book in the first place. So the idea really began 10 years ago when it became increasingly clear that the far right was mobilizing issues of women's rights. And so I and other comrades and colleagues, we really began to question what is going on exactly. Why are they trying to convince us that these political forces that are traditionally anti-feminist and that do not care really about women's rights or gender issues, why are they increasingly talking about women's rights? So I want to give you some examples. The first one, actually, this is a recent one. This is Vox in Spain. As you know, it's the right-wing, populist right-wing, as it's called, organization in Spain. And this is, I can't remember her name now, I'm sorry, but this is one of the spokespersons for the Madrid region, and is one of the leaders of Vox in the Madrid region. And recently she was interviewed. She's an architect, and so she was saying, well, usually when I do my work, I have to say to the workers, who are mostly male workers, builders, do this and do that. But then she says, I only felt discriminated when I give orders, when I tell Muslim men what to do. Which, again, is a clear way of saying, I am a woman, and it is Muslim men who are discriminating against me. They do not accept that a woman can tell them what to do. Another example, this is from Italy, and is from the Northern League. It's an old poster, actually, but I think it's incredibly telling. So I keep showing it. This, I think, is from 2006, so it's quite old. And it's when there were discussions in Europe about including Turkey as part of the European Union. And this is what the Northern League did, what they spread around the country. It's very, very clear. It says, are you willing to take this risk? Not to Turkey in Europe. And the message is incredibly clear. if you allow a Muslim majority country to enter into the European Union, this is the risk our women especially are running, because their women now are prisoners behind jails, and this is what could happen to our emancipated professional women. This is Marine Le Pen, more recently, during the so-called refugee crisis. She says, I fear that this refugee crisis could be the beginning of the end of women's rights, signaling again that all these Syrian refugees, all these refugees and migrants coming from Muslim-majority countries can represent a threat for women's rights. And this is very recent. This is really from a couple of months ago. This is Eric Zemmour. You might have heard of him. He was running for the presidential elections in France, far right, and interestingly, he has a history of being a total misogynist. In the past, he said things like women are inferior to men, they should stay at home, so quite explicitly misogynist things. But nonetheless, during the presidential campaign, he again used the issue of women's rights to attack Muslims by saying, for example, there is a video, this photo actually is from a video. I think it's incredibly interesting. If you have the chance, maybe look at this. So he went around, I think it was Saint-Denis, one of the banlieues in Paris, and he was talking to people around the banlieue. And this woman, this Muslim veiled woman, started attacking him and saying, why are you coming here? You are not welcome here. And he told her, well, why do you have your veil? It is probably your husband who is forcing you to wear your veil. Why don't you take it off? And she said, well, it's my, I'm religious, it's my identity. Why I choose to wear it. Why should I take it off? And he says, okay, if it's just a piece of clothing, you should be able to take it off. Show us that you are free. And so he takes off his tie to show, okay, I can take off my tie because it's just a piece of clothing. And she does take off her veil to say, okay, I can take it off. So I'm showing it to him. I mean, I'm saying this at length because I thought this is an example of extreme symbolic violence. So he's, I mean, she's doing that because a man, I mean, in a way, by doing that, she's doing exactly what he's accusing her of doing, because a man is asking her to do it. And so I find it a performative violence, which is incredible. But anyway, sorry for the length, just to say, this man, notoriously misogynist, going around and saying, I'm defending women's rights against Muslims. The next slide. So, after these examples, I don't have examples from Portugal. I'm sorry, I don't know much of the Portuguese case. And I would be very interested to learn from you the similarities or maybe some parallels that can be found in Portugal. But when I began observing these cases, I was really curious to understand what's going on exactly. Why are these right-wing parties using so much women's rights when it's so clearly hypocritical, when it's so clearly not credible? And I am a sociologist and a Marxist feminist. I have worked for many years on issues of gender and migration and representations of migrant women in Europe, as well as employment, labor market participation of migrant women. And so I was really curious to understand really how is that these, not necessarily migrant, but ethnic minority racialized women, such as Muslim women, are increasingly represented as victims that need to be saved. And so this is really how this book began. And so in this book, no, the previous one. So in this book, I really wanted to say I analyzed the convergence on anti-Islam politics by three very different political agendas, as Sophia was saying already. So I look at how right-wing nationalists, some feminists and femocrats, femocrats are simply usually female bureaucrats in gender equality agencies in the state, but I will talk about that, and neoliberal policies. And so I analyze how is that possible that there has been a convergence between these three very different political actors. And I do that specifically in the context of France, the Netherlands, and Italy. And my research covers the period between the early 2000s until 2013-14, more or less. The book was published in 17. But I am increasingly discovering how these things are really, really widespread. So from Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, you might know, to Marine Le Pen in France or Salvini in Italy, one of the central tropes that has been mobilized by these right-wing nationalists is the profound danger that Muslim males in particular constitute for Western societies, due above all to what they say is the oppressive treatment of women. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are also some well-known and outspoken feminists who have joined this anti-Islam choir. So throughout the 2000s, internationally renowned feminists such as Elisabeth Badinter or Ayaan Hirsi Ali in the Netherlands or some well-known feminists in Italy, they have increasingly depicted Islam as a religion and Muslim men in particular, or Muslim communities, as a danger for women. And I want to give you the example of Elisabeth Badinter. She's a famous French philosopher. She's a very prominent feminist, and she has had a very important role in the designing and implementation of the anti-veil laws in France. You might know that since 2004, Muslim girls cannot go to school, to public schools, wearing a veil. They have to take it off. And she's been one of the main promoters of this law. Since the end of the 1990s, throughout the 2000s, Elisabeth Badinter, together with other feminists, have increasingly really mobilized the state, the French state, to ban the Muslim veil in public spaces. And it's interesting, one of the things she says, this is from an interview, but it was specifically about the full veil. She says, well, these women are pathological. Muslim women, especially those who wear a full veil, are clearly pathological. And we should not be determined by their pathology. So this is the way she speaks, like they are voyeurs. It's quite violent, again, in terms of the language that she uses. So this is to say there are also some prominent feminists, and not necessarily right-wing feminists, actually some left-wing feminists too, are very much against Islam and very much against the wearing of the veil in public places and in public spaces. So in my book, I really try to understand, again, what is going on, how is that there is this convergence, these very different political forces are coming together against Islam in such a strong way. So, in terms of the neoliberal forces, because I said it's not just the right-wing parties, it is not just the feminists, also the neoliberals, who in many ways they are not nationalists, they are, the globalists who want to get rid of the nation state in a way, or at least of nationalism as a force. So how are they concerned with issues of Muslim women and women's rights? And the main example I want to make here is, this is another example of a Spanish feminist, the next slide. So the main example I want to make here is that of civic integration policies. So across Europe since the mid-2000s, there have been very important changes in migration policies and in integration policies, which means that increasingly migrants coming to France or to Italy or to the Netherlands or to other European countries, they need to pass a test demonstrating that they can speak the language of the country, but also that they know the history and the values of the country in order to obtain a visa. So integration and migration policies have become increasingly connected. Now, what's interesting, from my point of view, I went to do participant observations in the centers and places in which these integration policies are implemented. And it's really interesting to see how it works. So, for example, in France, just to give you one example, and the slide is about the French example, so migrants, newcomers go into a room in these specifically designated offices, and they are taught, there is really a lesson in which they are taught, okay, welcome to France. You should know the history of France, and they are shown videos about the values of France, you know, what is important to know when you live in France, etc. But what was really interesting for me was that when you look at these videos, there is a lot about equality between men and women. And this comes from a booklet that is given to these migrants when they go to these offices. And it's interesting because immediately after laïcité, immediately after secularism, which, as you know, is the main value of the French Republic, immediately after there is equality between men and women. So it has assumed an incredibly prominent role when it comes to migrants. So in these videos they show, can you see the women here in this country can be bus drivers, can be members of parliament, can do all those jobs that are considered to be you know, male jobs traditionally. They can open bank accounts. So there is an incredibly patronizing way of telling these migrants, well, it's kind of saying, assuming you probably don't know much about women's rights because you come from countries in which women's rights are not very important. So we are explaining to you, we are telling you that these are very important. Now, you might say there is nothing wrong about emphasizing women's rights and equality between women and men, and I agree, there is nothing wrong in doing that. It becomes a little bit problematic when first the assumption is that these men, in particular, do not know anything about women's rights, so they are immediately framed as oppressors and misogynists. But there is more than that, and I will tell you in the second part of this presentation. So all of this to say that the book is really driven by these three main questions. So it's really, why are different movements invoking the same trope and identifying Muslim men as one of the most dangerous threats to Western societies? Are we witnessing the rise of a new unholy alliance, or is this consensus across the political spectrum mainly coincidental and contingent? And finally, why are Muslim women being presented with offers of emancipation and rescue in a context of rising Islamophobia and anti-immigration sentiments, particularly regarding employment and welfare? Now, the third one, in a way, is the most important question. For me, really, the driving question is, why this double standard? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm speaking too fast. I'm sorry. So the main question for me is, a very important question for you to keep in mind is really the last one. So why the double standard? Why are Muslim men, but also other non-Western migrant men, presented as oppressors, as a sexual threat, and why are instead Muslim women or non-Western migrant women, because it's actually not just Muslims, as I will show, that are increasingly presented as victims? We are in a context of racism, raising racism, but interestingly, actually racism seems to work differently for men and women. The victims on one side and the oppressors on the other side. So I am very interested in understanding the reasons for this. And so in order to try to make sense of these paradox, if you like, or double standard, I coined this term, Femonationalism, which is short for feminist and democratic nationalism. It refers both to the exploitation of feminist themes by nationalists and neoliberals in anti-Islam, but also anti-immigration campaigns, and to the participation of certain feminists and femocrats in the stigmatization of Muslim men under the under the banner of gender equality. Femonationalism thus describes, on the one hand, the attempts of Western European right-wing parties and neoliberals to advance xenophobic and racist politics through the touting of gender equality, while on the other hand, it captures the involvement of various well-known and quite visible feminists and femocrats in the current framing of Islam as a quintessentially misogynistic religion and culture. So, in this presentation today, I want to suggest that femonationalism must be understood as an ideology that springs from a specific mode of encounter, or what I prefer to call a convergence, amongst different political projects, and that is produced by and productive of a specifically economic logic. So in the next part of this talk, I really want to focus on one dimension of femonationalism and explain femonationalism as neoliberal political economy. So this is what is, if you want, the main contribution of the book. I don't say that this is the only reason why these parties and forces are doing that. Is not only for political economic reasons, but is, in my view, an important reason that is usually not spoken about. So, as one thing to say, actually, there has been a debate in the field of gender studies, feminism, political science, etc., about why this is happening. So I'm not the only one or the first one to discuss this. What I really try to do in my work is to focus on the political economic logic, because I believe that this has not been explored. So there are a number of studies looking at these phenomena, including the work on homonationalism, which looks at the ways in which some of these parties are mobilizing gay and LGBTQ rights against Muslims. But all of these studies, they're very important, of course, but I don't think they pay much attention to the political economic reasons or dimensions of this phenomena. So, so why I say femonationalism is a neoliberal economic logic. So as I said, most studies treat neoliberalism as the economic theater of operation for the encounter between these different forces, but not as one of the main characters on stage. And while I agree that neoliberalism is central for understanding this phenomena, I think that neoliberalism is not simply the contextual ground on which the femonationalist convergence takes place, but it is itself constitutive of such a convergence. So I will, maybe if there is a question about this, I will explain a little bit more at length what this means, in what sense other studies have treated neoliberalism more as a kind of context, but not so much as constitutive of this femonationalism. I don't want to go too much into this now. So if you have a question, ask me, okay? And I will tell you later. So again, in order to understand how femonationalism is really, or if you want, has a political economic dimension very much rooted in neoliberalism, I really need to speak again of the civic integration policies that I was mentioning before. And again, there are lots of studies that have looked at these new civic integration policies, and lots of studies looking at the ways in which these civic integration policies have emphasized women's rights. So I gave you the French example. There was a very famous example in the Netherlands, because basically migrants going to the Netherlands where they had to watch a video of Dutch women sunbathing naked or topless on the beaches, and the message was, if you come to this country, you need to accept that women do this. And so again, there was lots of emphasis on the cultural aspects of this mobilization of women's rights, which are all very important. But what I wanted to see was these economic dimensions, as I said, and they become increasingly important in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2011. So after the financial crisis, integration policies begin to change, and increasingly European countries, member states of the European Union, are placing more emphasis on economic integration, okay? So they are saying increasingly, migrants, of course, they need to know the history and values of our countries in order to integrate, but they also need to get a job. The economic integration is very important because job and work is the main way of integrating in society. And in saying that, many of the European Union established a so-called Economic Integration Fund or European Integration Fund. So they started to give lots of money to different organizations across Europe, organizations that help or organize initiatives for the integration of migrants. And if you look at these documents, it's interesting that many of these policies are targeting especially migrant women, because the assumption is, statistically speaking, in Europe, migrant women tend to be more unemployed than migrant men. There is much more employment in the migrant male population, okay? And so these policies are saying we need to encourage the economic integration of these migrant women. But the underlying assumption is also, if we help migrant women to find a job, this is also helping them to emancipate, to gain economic independence, because very often these women come from very traditional societies, often misogynistic, backward societies, and therefore, by helping them to find jobs, we are also helping their emancipation. So again, a very ideological presupposition, particularly because many studies have shown that the reason why many migrant women do not work in Europe is not because their husbands or brothers do not allow them. It is because there is lots of discrimination against migrant women, especially if they wear a veil. Not many employers give a job to a Muslim veiled woman, so there is discrimination. There is a problem with language. In some countries it is not that easy to learn the language because sometimes these courses are not for free, they need to pay. But these discrimination and these other issues are not mentioned. There is really this framing of these women as being very traditional and needing emancipation from these European countries. And actually studies also show that very often these women had work experience and university degrees in their countries. So they're highly qualified, but they find it hard to find jobs in European countries. So what I did was I looked at the organizations and initiatives that received money between 2007 and 2013, specifically for initiatives to help migrant women to integrate, okay? So this is publicly available information if you go on the website of the European Economic Fund, sorry, the European Integration Fund. You can see which organizations have been funded over the last, I don't know, 10 years. And so I looked specifically which ones were specifically targeting women. And interestingly, there are some differences between the Netherlands, Italy and France, but not so many differences. So, for example, can you show the slide? Next one, because I already said all of this. So this is Promofam, which is a French organization. It's an organization, I mean, it's a great organization to help women, different women, to find jobs, it provides, for instance, even babysitting. It does different things from women, and especially migrant women. So these are some of the organizations that receive the money from the European Union to help migrant women integrate. And interestingly, when you look specifically, I have the link here, I'm not going to show to you, but just to say, when you look specifically at the activities that they did, they were helping these migrant women to become babysitters, or nannies, or elderly carers, or nurses, or cleaners. These are the main jobs that they were helping them to do. This is from Italy, and it's from an organization called Nosotras, which, again, it's a migrant women organization. It was funded, I believe, in the 1990s by both Latin American migrants in Bologna and Firenze, and by also some Italian women. So again, it's a great organization. They have done incredibly good things to help migrant women. And again, they received money from the European Integration Fund to help migrant women find jobs. And this is the testimony. She actually is one of the members of the organization, and she says, our job in this project, was to go with these women to their job interview, so to help them, for instance, with translation, with questions, etc. And they say the main jobs, I usually accompany migrant women to their job interview, and in almost all cases, it is for care and domestic work. This is actually the first Muslim MP in Catalonia, and it's just about, I was just looking at the Spanish case as well, and it's interesting that here they say there is lots of emphasis again, particularly by Vox, about Muslim women being, victims and Muslim men being oppressors, but they say, well, actually, Spanish employers, they do not give jobs to Muslim women if we wear the veil, so there is an acute problem of discrimination, which obviously is not helping these women to integrate. So what was interesting for me was really to see, okay, so we have this huge amount of money which is given by the European Union apparently to help emancipate these women, and there are women's organizations, very good women's organizations, implementing these projects. But it's interesting that the only jobs that these women do, apparently to become emancipated, is jobs in the so-called care and social reproductive sector. So they can only be babysitters, cleaners, elderly carers. So what was really interesting for me was really to see how there is a huge contradiction, I believe, especially for feminists, to claim that these women need to be emancipated, migrant women and Muslim women, but at the same time they are segregated not only in a job sector which pays very badly, because these are really jobs that with very, very low wages, but also it's a sector that really feminists wanted to escape. The last century of feminist struggles was all about liberating women from the domestic sphere. It was all about liberating women from the prison of the private sphere, of cleaning and caring for children. But it seems that when it comes to migrant and racialized women, that is emancipation, when it was the opposite of emancipation for the feminist movement in the 20th century. So what I say is that there is a huge contradiction for feminists in claiming to be saving and rescuing these women, when actually what they are doing is really sometimes ignoring, or in any case not addressing the huge problem, which is really the segregation of these women into these terribly organized social reproductive sectors. So I'm really going towards my conclusion. Next slide. Next one, I don't really want to. So maybe the last thing I will say is that on the one hand, I think there is this problem. So emancipation for migrant and racialized women and Muslim women seems to amount really to only being employed in the social reproductive sector. And this, I think, is a contradiction that feminists need to confront. But I want to speak again about, very briefly, about the right wing, because I began by saying how is that right-wing nationalists are applying this double standard. If they are so racist, how is that they seem to make a kind of exception for migrant women and Muslim women, and to say, okay, these women are victims, so we need to save them. Of course, the discourse is very complicated, but there seems to be that. And in my view, the most clear example of this it comes from Italy again. In 2009, in the midst of the global financial crisis, when in Italy we still had the Berlusconi government, Roberto Maroni was the Ministry of Interior, which in Italy is in charge of immigration policies. So in that year, they, as it happens after any financial crisis or any economic crisis, migrants are immediately framed as job stealers. Immediately there is saying, okay, these migrants are stealing our jobs, they are lowering our wages, so we don't want them anymore. It's a classic, it's really a mantra of any economic crisis. So in that year, Maroni said, we are not going to legalize migrants because priority will be given to Italian workers, but we are going to make an exception only for those jobs and for those really for those migrants who perform a very socially important function in our societies, such as elderly carers. So in 2009, there was a record number of regularizations of migrant women working as carers. There had never been such a big regularization as in that year. This is really, I think, speaks very well about why these, especially in countries that rely very heavily on the caring labor of migrant and Muslim women, I think this is one of the reasons, the political economic reasons why these right-wing nationalists are willing to close an eye, as it were, on these women. Because first, these women are really filling an important gap in the welfare state. They are really, how can we say, they are really doing those jobs and performing that function that the state, especially with all the neoliberal cuts over the last 30 years, is not doing anymore. But secondly, and I think quite importantly, the voting base of many of these parties are the middle classes that rely on the work of these women. And it's a very interesting, this is for another discussion, but it's very interesting how the middle classes are very happy to have these migrant women working in their families as long as they receive a low salary. So they know that this is the voting basis of these parties, especially in the north of Italy, which is where the Northern League began. And so they're willing to say, okay, we can actually accept these women because they are allowing our voters to have cheap caring labor for the elderly or for children. So I really want to conclude my last slide by saying that the double standard that is applied to Muslim and non-Western migrant women in the public imaginary as individuals in need of special attention and even rescue operates as an ideological tool that is strictly connected to the key role, present or future, in the reproduction of the material conditions of social reproduction or of care. So femonationalism, I think, should be understood as part and parcel of the specifically neoliberal reorganization of welfare, labour and state immigration policies that have occurred in the context of the global financial crisis and more generally the Western crisis of social reproduction. I will close here. This is also to say I don't think this is the only reason that these parties or the feminists and the neoliberals are doing this. There are other reasons too, but I just want you to pay some attention to the economic reasons because I think they are important. So I will close here. Thanks for the patience.